Hey, this is Harold. I'm going to make a recording today on the necessity and the limitations of randomized trial and policy research and practice, and talk about some of the math behind randomized trials, some of the ways that they can be used, and some of their pitfalls. Let's make sure I'm recording. There we go. I'm recording. I should say any views that I express today are just mine. They don't express any funders. A lot of this work comes out of the NIH HEAL initiative, which has funded some of the trials that I've done. Um, We're going to intrude today on a great debate in which the main antagonists on trials often talk past each other. Uh, People who are devotees of trials, or trialists, often assert that the critics of trials don't understand basic trial concepts that really can be explained on a napkin and are acknowledged on page one of most critiques of randomized trials. At the same time, critics often assert that trialists don't are unfamiliar with structural factors that when you run a trial, you see every day. And the trialists ignored issues of mechanism, implementation, context, and sustainment. Those are actually issues that trialists see every day, and actually, you have to specifically address if you want to get NIH funding if you're doing an RCT. You're literally not eligible for NIH funding if you don't consider these things. So people are not learning from each other. Uh, I know that a bunch of people that are watching Zoom have done randomized trials, so you've seen this issue before. I say in this room, in this Zoom room might be a better description. Let me start with the necessity and the value of randomized trials, and then I'll talk about some of their limitations. First of all, although there's a lot of excellent non-experimental statistical methods, and you guys are learning a lot of them, nothing matches randomized trials for causal inference, simplicity, and credibility. Um, and there's just a lot of reasons for that, but there's nothing quite like a randomized trial when you can do it. You want to Randomized trial also offers really unique opportunities to explore mechanism and implementation concerns, particularly in the kind of hybrid designs that are now the rage in a lot of things that NIH funds and others that explicitly address implementation, sustainment, replication, scaling. Uh, the field has really advanced in that way. And then another thing that Chris Blattman and others have noticed that, when you do a randomized trial, you're kind of out there in the field and you're wrestling with the implementation practicalities. And that gives you kind of tactile insights regarding the lives of your study subjects, uh, their families, your intervention staff, communities, uh, and people. And trialists really see the real stuff. And you're spending time in Cook County Jail, walking around doing stuff or whatever. We at Crown sometimes have some very stereotypical views where we think of people who do randomized trials as somehow less sophisticated about structural issues, things like that, and that's just not true. The other thing is that randomized trials, efficacy and mechanism trials, allow us to explore causal pathways and to capture what's possible, even if the tested interventions are not always politically feasible or scalable. Jens Ludwig and colleagues have a really nice article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives way back in 2011. Uh, my my colleagues on campus are doing a randomized trial where they propose that everybody leaving prison in Florida gets $750 a month in this trial. Um, all their study subjects. Um, and they're going to see, how that affects people's lives. Is that a feasible policy in terms of American politics? Probably not. But we'll learn a lot of useful stuff from that. How do people's lives change when they have a basic income of that nature? Um, and sometimes you have um, an experiment or a policy evaluation where you don't precisely understand why the thing's working, but but you see, hey, there's a big effect here, and that can be valuable too. And um, and I'll talk about that later. So why do we do randomized experiments? As I mentioned, causality is just really important. when you randomize, you have treatment assignment that's unrelated to the observed characteristics of study participants or balance between treatment and control groups, but also unobserved stuff that you can't take into account that you may not know about. Uh, and there's just nothing like randomization to leave out to ameliorate lots of sources of bias that we can't explicitly address. Policymakers certainly view RCTs as much more credible than almost anything else. Unfortunately, that partly reflects the fact that policymakers are very cynical about researchers. Policymakers assume that the academic researchers are advocates for the programs that we talk about, and they want to see pre-registered trial outcomes to know whether to take us seriously. And I get where that's coming from. Uh, there's no one gold standards that answers every question. Uh, Within the proper domain of application, rigorous causal inference and internal validity, randomized trials are the closest that we come to methodologically. Um, they're I should say that the fancy non-experimental statistical methods have definitely gotten better over the years, and you're learning a lot of them in your classes. But they're still often fragile and can be overconfident or misleading. One of the most important papers in this literature now goes back 40 years. Robert Lalonde, who was at University of Chicago, uh, he actually took data from a field experiment of employment supports where he knew the answer from a randomized trial. And he applied lots of fancy non-experimental econometric methods to the data. And what he found was he was getting answers all over the map, tight confidence intervals that did not include the correct answer that came out of the trial. And this really was a devastating paper for a lot of these methodologies because it showed, when we actually knew what the correct answer should be, we often would get the wrong answer when we're using sort of state-of-the-art non-experimental methods. And there's just nothing like an RCT for the specific questions RCTs are well designed to answer. Now, just to give you an example, I'll give you one example from that's important in the history of public policy. Um, without randomization, we can compare outcomes among people who received a treatment to the outcomes among people who didn't receive a treatment. The problem is we can get really misleading results if people self-select or are somehow selected into the intervention in a way that matters for the outcome. So one of the most complicated and controversial examples was the Gautreaux desegregation settlement of the 1970s. Chicago Housing Authority was found to have racially discriminated against Black people, and there was a settlement where low-income single moms and kids in CHA could volunteer to move to racially and economically integrated areas, such as where I'm making this video right now in Flossmoor. Um, there, People analyzed the Gautreaux data and employed statistical models that controlled for things like mothers' years of education, family size, other obvious things. And they found that families really benefited a lot from this intervention. And in fact, recent very well done analyses show participants really did benefit, particularly when they moved to economically and racially integrated areas like Flossmoor. But the earlier analyses of Gautreaux really overstated the benefit of the intervention. And the reason is that people had self-selected in ways that were just really hard to control in a statistical model. And one of the challenges they had in the 1970s was there's a tremendous amount of racism around Chicagoland. The people in CHA were deeply stigmatized. And so the people who ran the Gautreaux program really tried to operate it in a way that would minimize, the backlash from landlords and communities. So one of the things that they did is that they employed selection criteria uh, that were designed to prevent conflict with landlords. So, uh, so one of the things they did is they would exclude people who have made late rent payments, uh, who had who had various issues in CHA that were often under the label of unacceptable housekeeping. And you don't have a variable in a data set that comes from the census or whatever that's unacceptable housekeeping or late rent payments. Uh, but those things are related to how those families were doing in lots of other ways. And so by excluding those people, and by picking people who were the pioneer, the volunteer, the Gattro families who volunteered, they were kind of the pioneers. They were willing to go into some pretty intimidating situations where they're leaving, their own neighborhoods and they're going into uh, uh, often majority white areas in Chicago. There was a particular group of person who was going to volunteer to do this from CHA. And it turned out that there was a kind of self-selection uh, that seemed to be related to more positive outcomes as they track people over time. So when you can't randomize, you do have lots of weird problems that emerge of this nature. I should say that the recent Quarterly Journal of Economics just published something in Gattro, which actually did show that there were some important benefits to this, particularly when people did end up in high opportunity neighborhoods, as Raj Chetty or others would define them, uh, but that the original studies did overstate some of the benefits. When in the movement opportunity experiment, when that was done, uh, um, there were some pretty disappointing findings. There was mixed, but some pretty disappointing findings. I should say null findings are really important and valuable. And as a field, we want to give null findings when this, particularly in a well-run study or pre-registered trial. We want to give the researchers the same high fives that we would give if the study had given a more dramatic and satisfying result. The science is what it is. You give someone a high five based on the quality of the work that they did, not based on the result that they got. One of the challenges we have is we have a very high degree of publication bias, and we often don't give that high five. One of the interesting null findings came out of the Oregon health insurance experiment, which tested a politically congenial talking point. I should say that this talking point was used a lot in my own career. I was the I co-chaired the public health advisory group of the Obama campaign in 2008, and I was one of the people that was advocating for universal coverage. And Hillary Clinton, lots of other people were making the point, if we had universal coverage, we'd have much more efficient use of healthcare resources. For example, people would go to a primary care doctor rather than the emergency department if they had a problem. You walk into an emergency department, you see a lot of uninsured people in bad circumstances getting what are basically primary care services. Very intuitive point. There's only one problem. There was never any evidence that this talking point was accurate. So the Oregon health insurance experiment randomized people into a treatment group that where they could be in a lottery to get enrolled in Medicaid. And they looked at what happened. And what happened was that people that got Medicaid were more likely to use the emergency department. And in fact, they were more likely to use the emergency department for conditions that were called primary care treatable. Now, I should say, by the way, this is actually a good outcome in terms of the world, in terms of those people, in terms of their well-being. The financial impact of this was one extra ED visit every 3 years, $123 per person per year. There's nothing bad about this. But it was politically damaging because it debunked a talking point that wasn't true. Uh, and But this was an important finding because it helped us to understand, what does happen when you give people access to Medicaid. And there's lots of reasons why people use the emergency department. And there's also lots of reasons why this is not a bad thing that this happened. It's just people were just latching onto a bad talking point that, when it turned out to be incorrect, made this seem like it was a real problem when it's not. Um, Let me say some things about constituencies that want to be the gatekeepers for randomized trials. This is the Harold Ramble portion of the lecture. There's a lot of that in this one. Um, there's always going to be uncongenial findings or politically not helpful findings. If you look at guaranteed income interventions, there's some good findings and there's, the people benefited, and there's some other findings that showed people didn't benefit as much as we had hoped, or people had things like slightly reduced labor supply, which from a political point of view is a not a great outcome if you believe in guaranteed income interventions. Uh, and we see the same thing within the Oregon health insurance experiment. It improved people's mental health. Uh, the impact on physical health wasn't nothing, but it was disappointingly small compared to some earlier things like the Rand health insurance experiment might have led us to expect. And certainly, I've done randomized trials where we have gotten disappointing findings. Where we had hoped that we would see outcomes that we didn't, but we just didn't see the movement we'd hoped. And that's you gotta be very transparent and present those things with the same uh, emphasis as the ones that you think are politically congenial to your own personal uh, perspectives. By the way, the other thing about gatekeeping is to making sure that people who are opponents of certain kinds of interventions can't be in a position to suppress findings that they find embarrassing. So in Chicago, one of the real challenges we have is that a lot of the RCTs don't always look great from the point of view of public employee unions. So all across the country, there have been a number of randomized trials that involve no excuses charter schools and public school choice models. And what they find is the well implemented no excuse charter schools and public choice models seem to be beneficial to students across the ability range. There's this idea that school choice, that charter schools are cream skimming students and so on. And no, that's actually not what's happening when these things are well run. Uh, and randomized evaluations actually show that if you among elementary school students that if you randomly assign students to Teach for America fellows versus veteran teachers in the same school, that the students assigned to the Teach for America fellows score significantly higher in math and score higher, although not statistically significant higher in reading. You can imagine that teachers unions are not overjoyed with those results. Uh, that's the these bullets are the ones that conservatives like to talk about. There's also another one. So the choose one of the most embarrassing RCTs uh, got into the way that members of the Chicago Police Department do clear racial profiling. So um, the University of Chicago Crime Lab an education lab did an intervention called Choose to Change, which reduced criminal offending among boys in Chicago high school boys. And they looked at police encounters where they compared the treatment group and the control group. And they had two different kinds of police encounters. One was this kid likely committed a crime and then he had a police encounter. And that was lower in the treatment group than in the control group. The other was the types of encounters that people have that indicate racial profiling. And what they found for those was it was exactly the same between the treatment group and the control group. Because helping a kid commit fewer crimes does not make the officer that's profiling any less racist. And you can imagine that that's also, a politically complicated result for Chicago police unions. The other thing is when we think about community stakeholders, um, I work with a lot of people in community, and one thing that's very good, first of all, the term the community is um, quite a complex term. It includes a very large group of constituencies, uh, and who has influence and voice in a particular community uh, doesn't always include everyone. If you say just this, when people say the community, are people who are LGBTQIA well represented? Often not. Are people who are experience substance use disorders represented? Often not. And one of the things that we found is a lot of faith-based organizations are very fond of abstinence-based opioid use disorder treatments. And by the way, there's lots of reasons why they are, partly because there's so many problematic behaviors that come with substance use that, of course, cause pain in community. Uh, the problem is that that if someone has an opioid use disorder and you send them to Narcotics Anonymous rather than to buprenorphine or methadone treatment, NA doesn't work like very well by comparison. And so it's very important to make sure that people are being sent to evidence-informed interventions, which in the case of opioid use disorders is really medication opioid use disorder treatment. And one of the challenges that we have is that sometimes people in community do not support that. Um, and from an ethical perspective, one of the things that I believe is very strong is that we owe our study subjects and the people we're trying to help our primary loyalty. So we owe students more than we owe teachers or the nonprofit service providers or others. We owe patients more than we owe the doctors and the nurses, and so on. And one of the things that I like about randomized trials is that sometimes they bring accountability uh, to the people that are both a part of the problem and a part of the solution who are often involved in service delivery. And we really want to teach we want to treat healthcare providers with respect and support their work. We want to treat teachers with respect and support their work. But we also want to understand, what's working and what's not working. And uh, um, so it's important for us to keep that in mind and not to allow influential constituencies to block us from doing the kinds of rigorous studies we need to be doing. Now let me get into some of the X's and O's. Probably the most important single vocabulary distinction I want to make is thinking about intent to treat versus effective treatment on the treated group. When we do an experiment, we really get two different kinds of answers. One is called the ITT and the other is called the TOT. So the ITT is when we have a treatment group that we offer. But let me refine what I just said. What we often refer to as the treatment group is really the people who are invited to participate in a certain intervention, and some will do that and some will not do that. The intent to treat compares how do the group that you offer the treatment, invited the treatment for, how does that group do differently from the people who are not invited, who are maybe in a control group or usual care. That's intent to treat. And in some ways, that's actually the most directly policy relevant thing. We offer this service. What are we going to get from it? Well, what we're going to get from it is a combination of how effective is that service for the people who get it and how many people choose to get it. And the intent to treat captures both those things. Now, the effect of the treatment on the treated group is among the people who actually did get the intervention. What happened? Now, I should say, if you've taken econometrics and taken instrumental variables, the TOT is what you get if you regard treatment group assignment as an instrumental variable for whether you actually got the treatment, and you run the two-stage least squares that you may have learned about from some other econometrics class. What comes out of that is the TOT. Now, when an intervention helps people, what we actually directly observe is the intent to treat. There's lots of stuff happening under the hood that produces that TOT. So there's a bunch of people who actually got the intervention and they got some benefit, and there's some fraction of the people that were invited, and they're actually producing the entire group average, that's driving the ITT. But what you're actually observing is, how did the group invited, how did they do compared to the people who weren't invited? That is by far the most reliable thing that we actually observe when we do an RCT, because you don't have to get into the complicated selection process about who actually took up the treatment versus not, a bunch of stuff like that. So, uh, the ITT, from my mind, that is the most reliable thing I ever get from a randomized trial. Now, I should say when the take-up is low among the people that are offered a treatment, the ITT will be much less than the effect of the treatment on the treated group. And I'll give you an numerical example in a minute. Uh, but in general, the ITT is going to be a smaller number because take-up isn't perfect. But I'm always, in a lot of ways, I think the ITT is the first thing that I personally am always looking for. Although the economists often are more focused on the TOT because that's often where the causal modeling is coming in. Now, let me just give more advertising for the ITT. There's some really valuable insights that come with an ITT perspective. First of all, program take-up is not some incidental detail. It's actually a central component of program effectiveness. One of the things that we often overlook is the program is the official intervention, but it's also everything you do to mobilize people and engage them in that treatment. Very often we have programs that are pretty intensive and have low take-up. And so you find an impressive treatment of the treated on treated group, but you find a lousy ITT. And program designers like to say, oh, we have a great program. It's just these people, they just won't come to it. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, whatever. That's not good. Because if you're offering an intervention, you can't figure out how to help people engage it and make a persuasive case to people, you're doing something wrong. And I'll give you an example. We did something called the Supportive Release Center at Cook County Jail, which our funders hoped would reduce violent offending. We actually set up trailers right outside Cook County Jail. And people leaving the Cook County Jail could come and stay, if it's like 10 o'clock at night, you had no place to be, you could come and stay in the Supportive Release Center and get hooked up with services and stuff like that. And when we think about what works and doesn't work in something like the SRC, it really forces us to confront a lot of the broader sociology of interventions that we'd like to see used. So as I said, we hoped that the SRC would reduce violence. It did not. And it did not for one obvious reason, that the young guys did not want to come. Our older borderline homeless dudes who were borderline, they loved the program. We got pretty high take-up among our older borderline homeless dudes. And we found in that group, we reduced crime by about a third in the immediate post-release period. But the younger guys saw those older guys and they said, I am not that guy. They looked, there was very stigmatized, these sort of older guys with substance use issues and mental health issues who, were socially isolated, were highly stigmatized. So the ITT was effectively zero for everyone under age 45. Now, we could have said our program's great. It's just the young people didn't want to come. That's not a defense of the way we implemented the SRC. What we should have done with the SRC is figured out a way to make it more effective for the younger guys and less stigmatizing. Now, the TOT is of interest in that, but it was a failed intervention for the younger guys, and the ITT being basically zero, is that's reality. Let me give you more examples. Another one is methadone treatment. If you think about methadone through the lens of biochemistry of neural receptors, methadone is a really effective medication for opioid use disorders. It really is. In a lot of ways, it's the best medication we have. Although there's reasons why other medications like buprenorphine are often preferred. But unfortunately, the daily realities of methadone treatment are very undignified and logistically challenging for a lot of people. The first time I went to a methadone treatment program, I was really kind of shocked. It was like watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The sort of disrespect with which a lot of the patients were treated, the inconvenience of the way people had to come to the clinics so often. And so we see disappointing results on a lot of social outcomes associated with methadone treatment because methadone treatment is not just the drug, it's everything about the way it's offered and delivered. It's attractiveness, feasibility, dignity, utility. Um, and it's not a good intervention when all those things, for many, many people in many contexts, when we evaluate it in that way. Now, fortunately, the Biden administration did something called the SAMHSA final rule that started to address some of the challenges in methadone treatment. I hope that the Trump administration will continue to implement that. Uh, but whenever we talk about a treatment for human beings, it's the human experience of it. It's not just the chemical. And the ITT captured that really well. Now let me get into some of the math. So let's talk about how the ITT and the TOT are related. So suppose Y is an outcome that I care about. Like maybe it's whether I'm rearrested, something like that. And X is some intervention that's more likely to happen if I'm assigned to the treatment group, Z equals 1, invited to do X, compared to the control group, Z equals 0. So I now want to understand how X depends, how the actual exposure to the thing, to this treatment here, X, how that actually affects the outcome. So in so um, so in the case that I'm talking about in 12 seconds, X might be hours of tutoring that kids get, and Y could be kids' test scores. So so the the intent to treat effect is just the difference in the outcome between the treatment group and the control group. And then and this what's here, what I call the TOT, this is really what's the effect of the treatment for the people who got it. And what and and this thing that's called the Wald coefficient. Waldbauer was a refugee. I often think about people such as him in their current political context. Basically, what the what the Wald coefficient says is the ITT, if I just multiply both sides by the denominator here, the ITT is the product of the effect of the treatment on the people who got it, multiplied by how many more people got the treatment if they were in the treatment group compared to if they were in the control group. And so if I just, so intuitively, this numerator, the ITT, it's the product of how effective is the treatment for the people who get it, and how much did I move how many people got it. That's what this ratio is. So let me give you a concrete example. Now, take a moment. At no point did my fingers leave my hand on that. I'll just say it again. The ITT, the difference in the Y's, is the effectiveness of the treatment for the people who actually get the treatment multiplied by how much more of the treatment did people get because they were in the treatment group rather than the control group. That's what this ratio captures. So let me give you a practical example. So suppose I hypothesize that math tutoring is going to raise test scores. So I do a randomized trial where I offer $10 GameStop cards to every high school senior in the treatment group who agrees to attend 4 p.m. tutoring sessions. And so when I do this, I find that 55% of the treatment group gets tutoring and only 45% of the control group gets tutoring. So I've moved, assuming my randomization is correct, I've moved the proportion getting tutored from 45% to 55%. So there's 10 percentage point increase in the proportion of people that are getting tutoring. Okay? Now let's say the mean math scores are 63 in the treatment group and 61 in the control group. And let's just, I'm not showing you any confidence intervals, whatever. We won't worry about that right now. So the intent to treat estimate is just 63 minus 61. That's 2 points. That's the effect of inviting people to be tutored. Now, what's the effect of the actual tutoring? That's where we go and we look at this equation. That 2 points, this ITT is the product of the difference in the proportion of people that got tutoring multiplied by the effect of the tutoring for the people who actually got it. Okay. So that's another way of saying that, if I just work out this ratio, what that's going to say is that the Wald coefficient here, the Wald ratio, is going to be 2 points divided by 10 percentage points, which is zero point 0.1. So 2 divided by zero point 0.1 is 20. What that's basically saying is you got a tenth of the people to move differently. And those people are called treatment compliers, or people who would have not gotten tutoring, but because they liked the GameStop cards, they got tutoring. Those people are creating that 2 point difference in the group means. So they have to go up by 20 points for that to happen. Okay? Now you might say, what's the most informative number here, the 2 or the 20? And the answer is both. They're both, depending on what the question is. If you say, what will happen to the population if I offer GameStop cards, I'm going to get a 2 point advantage on average. That's really valuable. But if I say, hey, what does tutoring do? That 20 is very informative. Now, one thing that might take into account is what we're learning about are the people whose behaviors moved by this intervention. There's a group of people who really like GameStop cards, who agree to be tutored, who wouldn't have been tutored otherwise because I gave out the GameStop card. And probably that means I'm learning more about boys than I am about girls, just because the boys tend to be more into that. So if I want to disseminate that intervention, I'd want to, this would be effective if I could go places where I knew a lot of people were into GameStop, or I have to find something else that would be equally attractive that might get to some of the kids who are not into the GameStop. So, um, so what's striking about this example is it's a totally play example, which I made up. Boy, it's got a lot in it. And it's surprising how much is embedded in this toy example. Now, another question you might ask is, how do I understand a confidence interval around this thing? By the way, for those of you that took instrumental variables, this thing here is basically the coefficient you'd get if I did a two-stage least squares model and I said I'm going to use treatment assignment as an instrumental variable for did you get the treatment? And if you look, those of you that took, a more complicated econometrics course, there'd be a bunch of matrix algebra here. And that's exactly this ratio if you're taking into account that you may have some confounders in there too. So, taking into account age, race, whatever, you'd have some matrix equations there. But it's the same thing. Now, how would I get a confidence interval on this thing? Bootstrapping is the world's greatest thing. I'm a huge believer in bootstrapping, and you can do that in R, you can do that in Stata, Python, especially when you have outcomes and error terms that are just not normally distributed. Bootstrapping is just phenomenal. Now, let me talk some about what one might call a black box experiment. Sometimes you do a randomized trial and you get a strong effect, but you don't exactly know why. There's some secret sauce in there, but it's still secret after you did the experiment. One of my most famous trials, Becoming a Man, was a little like that. We showed we had some real benefits, but it wasn't exactly clear what about the intervention was causing that. A lot of cancer trials and early HIV medication trials were like that too. Now, what's interesting is the NIH will not fund a black box trial. If you propose to NIH that you're going to do a trial and you say, I think Becoming a Man is going to really reduce arrests among kids, and here's my proposal. I'm going to do a randomized trial and I'm going to see if that happens. You won't get funded. You won't even be considered in the study section. You have to identify and test mechanisms, attend to context and related concerns. So here's for example, NIMH's official policy. NIMH requires an experimental therapeutic approach for the development and testing of therapeutic, preventive, and service interventions in which the studies evaluate not only the clinical effect of the intervention, but also generate information about the mechanisms underlying a disorder or an intervention response. Studies must clearly identify a target or mediator of the intervention being tested. A positive result will require that an intervention improves clinical outcomes and has a demonstrable effect on a target, such as a neural pathway, a key cognitive operation, interpersonal or contextual factor that is hypothesized to mediate the intervention's effect. So when you hear people with randomized trials don't think about mechanism, things like that, if they didn't think about that, they would never have gotten funded. So NIH is very focused on that, and that promotes in a lot of ways a more rigorous approach to trials. There are times when that's a little bit too rigid. So Sidney Farber was the godfather of cancer research. The Dana-Farber Cancer Institute is named after him. By the way, trivia fact: the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, their budget is pretty similar to the World Health Organization's total budget. If you say, why is it that the World Health Organization hasn't produced miracles on COVID and stuff like that? Its budget is like one US cancer center for the entire world. But Farber was testifying before Congress, and he said, we cannot wait for full understanding. The 325,000 patients with cancer who are going to die this year cannot wait, nor is it necessary to make great progress in the cure for cancer for us to have the full solution of all the problems of basic research. The history of medicine is replete with examples of cures obtained years, decades, and even centuries before the mechanism of action was understood for these cures, from vaccination to digitalis to aspirin. And I should say that's especially true in cancer care. A lot of the famous chemotherapies were poisons that people noticed. Hey, this is reducing. This is causing tumors to shrink. There's a wonderful book called The Emperor of All Maladies, which is the history of cancer care. And one of the things that they point out is there's a ship that had mustard gas in it, and it was blown up, and the plume wafted over to a cancer ward, and they found that it reduced the tumors among the patients that were exposed to the mustard gas. So, a lot of cancer treatment, it was kind of black box. I should say that's less true today than it used to be. If you look at treatments like Levox, for example, there's much more now that is based on a real understanding of the biochemistry of cancer in a much more specific way. And there's some of the breakthroughs in pancreatic cancer and other things are kind of amazing because they really did reflect a much deeper biological understanding of cancer than prior chemotherapies did. Now, as I said, you have to understand mechanism and context and so on. One of the things that I've become really aware of is the importance of implementation science as a way to address that. It's attention to the organizational capacities required to successfully implement an intervention, sort of the internal and external barriers and facilitators of successful implementation. A lot of what's in implementation science is putting fancy GRE words on stuff that already was in the prior management and implementation research. And Nicole Marwell and others are quite sophisticated students in this literature. What's important in RCTs is the way these are being increasingly linked to RCTs through hybrid designs in a very explicit way through various implementation science frameworks. One is called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. There's another one called the EPIS, another one called REAIM. There's a whole alphabet soup thing. We have a real FOLA problem in implementation science. FOLA is four-letter acronym. But so I have a grant now under review that is trying to help police do a better job of responding to overdoses and related emergencies when children are present. And a lot of what we're asking is, what are the organizational capacities police require to provide a more child-centric approach? What are the community contextual factors that are important to making linkages to different kinds of services and so on? And implementation science really asks you to pay attention to what needs to be done to field, sustain, scale up, and disseminate a promising intervention across settings. So it's more than just we found a difference between the treatment group and the control group, and it's even more than we showed that the mechanism moved. It's also we've actually looked at what has to happen for this to really be replicable. And Alita Boris and I have a chapter on randomized trials, which I'm happy to share, where we have a play example of a sort of Narcan distribution thing. This is this is this is a framework called REAIM. REAIM is reach, effectiveness, adoption, implementation, and maintenance. Um, so, um, you effectiveness is the classic trial outcomes kind of stuff. Uh, the um, reach is really how realistically um, how widely can this be disseminated in the populations that really need this thing. Um, and adoption is really what are some ways that a particular intervention has to be tweaked, say between an urban and a rural environment or something like that. Um, and then there's various, and you can see implementation and maintenance. You can see are similar things. Um, how can we institutionalize something? By the way, one of the key things that is important in the maintenance phase is often how do we get this thing reimbursed? So Medicaid is the ball game for a lot of the interventions that I'm interested in. And a lot of the stuff that happens in the maintenance phase is really, can this thing become a Medicaid reimbursable service so that organizations will make a serious investment in the intervention? If you give a 2-year grant, the University of Chicago is not going to make a serious institutional investment in a novel intervention to help people, because what's going to happen after that 2-year grant's over? Whereas if there's a Medicaid procedure code for the thing, they say, oh, we can get paid if we do this. So we can actually make that big investment to set up a new, particular kind of addiction treatment facility, whatever it is. Um, so the REAIM is one of the frameworks that is valuable for this. Now, so I've just identified a bunch of things that show why RCTs are great. Let's talk about some of the limitations of RCTs. So here's a good example that brings out some of the challenge. So in the 1970s, social scientists worried that employers just didn't want to hire economically disadvantaged young men in the low wage market. And people quite properly concerned, we have to find a way that that people can get jobs. And so policy advocates hypothesize that if one offers targeted wage subsidies to employers, that would make it more profitable to hire um, economically disadvantaged young men. More young men would get jobs, and this would improve the life standards of those young men. And it was kind of the forerunner to the earned income tax credit. So a randomized trial was run where treatment participants were given a voucher. They could go to, say, McDonald's, and the voucher would say, "Dear manager of McDonald's, if you hire Harold, we will pay 50% of their hourly wages in the first year and 25% in the second year." Um, and so just you hire him, and we'll just reimburse you for that. I think what's good and bad about this experiment, and what do you think happened? I'll just take a moment for you to think about that. So here's the experiment there. I should say there were two different ways that employers could get reimbursed: the tax credit and a direct rebate. So they had a control group, and in the control group, only 20.6% of the guys ended up with jobs. So what do you think happened with these two different groups? Here's what happened. You ready? It harmed the beneficiaries. They were less likely to get hired when the people in the treatment groups with the vouchers were less likely to be hired than the control group by a lot, like a third less likely to be hired. What do you think happened? Here's what happened. It was really stigmatizing. The manager of the McDonald's, Harold walked in, Harold hands the guy the voucher, and the McDonald's manager is like, WTF, like, what is the matter with Harold that you're offering to to pay me if I hire him? I have a kitchen. I've got thousands of dollars worth of equipment. I've got lots of other employees there. I've got all these customers. I, I don't want somebody who's a problem in my kitchen. I don't care if you're subsidizing the wage. It's not worth it to me. Um, and um, and it was a useful finding actually because targeted benefits can often bring unintentional stigma, and that's something that is important to take into account. A lot of targeted training programs, we do sometimes find that they harm the recipients because they have that kind of labeling effect. The experiment, although it was well executed on its own terms, was not giving us any information about a broad social policy, though. Suppose that we put in an earned income tax credit and every low-wage worker uh, effectively, if we put a heavy wage subsidy on low-wage workers, a lot of that's going to percolate to the employers, uh, so that the employers have an incentive they can hire people at a pretty low wage, given that the earned income tax credits supplementing that. They can say, hey, I'll be a little bit less capital intensive and I'll hire a little bit more workers, and the EITC makes that feasible. And there's no stigmatizing effect of the EITC because every low wage worker has it. So, I'm not having a negative view if someone applies for that job, that they're getting that at EITC. They're just another job applicant. The thing that the EITC does, uh, that is different from that experiment is it has a totally different implication for the social identity of the person who's a participant in the program. Uh, and we see other examples like that too. For example, before the mid 1980s, a very large fraction of pregnant and parenting persons were uninsured. And uh, one could have done an RCT in 1980 where you gave every pregnant patient a voucher and said, you show up at the University of Chicago Hospital and we'll pay for all the prenatal care. Um, and there would be some real value in that experiment. But what you would not see is the impact of what the actual Medicaid expansion did a few years later, because when we basically at this after the 1980s, pretty much every pregnant patient was insured. Uninsured rates among pregnant patients really plummeted with Medicaid expansions. So there was an entire infrastructure of perinatal care that was developed that grew out of that, uh, that you could never have seen from an individual experiment. The fact that people built entire wings of hospitals because they knew that every labor and delivery was basically going to be covered by Medicaid. I'm glossing over some of the details, but you can see the very large systemic change that Medicaid brought about you would have never seen from an individual RCT. And in fact, some of the non-experimental methods used by Janet Curry, John Gruber, and others to look at these things, where they found there was a significant benefit, significant health benefit, uh, they gave up something compared to if they had a true RCT for some of the causal inference, but they could have a much more sophisticated look at broad policies. So sometimes uh, you can't look at broad policies through RCTs. There, and by the way, the Ludwig, I highly recommend that Ludwig article from 2011 because they go through a lot of examples. For example, if you want to understand what's the impact of uh, food deserts on nutrition, one of the studies that Ludwig and colleagues talk about is, you could have a randomized trial where you have 1,000 people, you gave 500 of them, Instacart, and so they could get free groceries. Um, is there a difference in nutritional outcome between the Instacart people and the other people? Um, that would help you understand a broad social question in an interesting way, although it's not exactly clear how that would be translated into policy. Now, let me give one more confession, my fidelity problems. I think the field needs a different word when we try to think about how to how to adapt what we consider to be an evidence-based model. Almost every intervention that we think of, that we test with an RCT, there's if we want to apply that someplace else, there has to be some local adaptation. And explicit adaptation should be noted and praised rather than treated as a departure from an evidence-based model. And it's really important that we honor that. And um, implementation science pays attention to that, and so on. But I think very often when we think about fidelity assessment, there's a presumption that, hey, you shouldn't be departing from the original model, and that's often incorrect. Like we did a critical time intervention for low-level people leaving Cook County Jail. And the program implementers made many important changes to the model, which was actually developed in New York City. And they needed to get a high five for making those changes, not worry that they get dinged because they departed from the standardized model and they were somehow being unfaithful to it. Now, ironically, people that practitioners of a well-executed RCT, uh, people who do those understand why you need local adaptation. Because when you did your trial, you did a bunch of pragmatic adaptations to a program model. Uh, but one of the reasons why it's really important to do a randomized trial with careful structured attention to context and implementation is that you want to help people when they have to make local adaptations, when they try to apply that intervention in a different place. And it's really dangerous to treat the results of any trial as providing a standard out-of-the-box program model that's evidence-based, because there's always reasons why local context matters. Sometimes it's the capacity of the local organization. Sometimes it's the particular population of people getting the service. Sometimes it's just what's happening in the broader community around where you're providing the service. But you really have to pay attention to that. Other challenges to experiments. Follow-up. Oh, that's the hardest thing. A lot of the time, we obtain the critical outcome data from trials from the people that we're able to successfully track. So we're surveying those people and then we resurvey them post-intervention, 6 months later or whatever. A lot of the trials that we do, that's where we understand the outcomes. That's a real challenge for a lot of reasons. One is that the people who think highly of the intervention and of the research team are the people who are willing to stay in contact with you. And particularly if you have a treatment group and a less intensive comparator, the people in the treatment group have a lot more reason to stay connected than the people that are in the usual care control, less intensive comparator group. So you often get a real difference in response rates between across your treatment arms. And that creates a real journal of selection bias kind of situation, because the people who did really well in the intervention are the ones who are the most jazzed to stay engaged. And so one possibility of bias is that the people that you lose track of are the people that did poorly in the intervention. And so you're overstating the benefit of the intervention. That's one possibility. But the bias can also go the other way. Suppose you have people in your treatment group and they really like you a lot because you are providing a treatment for them, but they're still having a poor outcome. They may be more likely to stay connected with you than the people who have a poor outcome who are in the less intensive treatment arm. And so you could actually get bias against the intervention because the people that are having disappointing outcomes still want to be in relationship with you. Um, Now there's some ways we can deal with that follow-up challenge to try to reduce the bias. One is, which I have not always done effectively, and Illinois is such a disaster with some of this stuff, is you get proper consents, and from the very beginning of the study, you get administrative data that doesn't require an in-person follow-up. One of the things when you're looking at things like rearrest in Chicago, uh, you can see if somebody's been arrested, even if they don't want to talk to you anymore. And if you have all their healthcare data, you can see things about their healthcare, even if you lose track of them personally. So I think we really have to raise our game as a state in making sure that we have administrative data that is widely available for trials. The second is to earn relationship with people and to maintain positive relationships with all your study participants. If people don't want to talk to you anymore, that's is always worth asking, gee, why is that person not feeling like they want to be in relationship with me? And how do I make sure that that I'm earning the trust and relationship from all my study subjects? And, um, now there's some other challenges I should mention. One is just time. So maybe the most prominent randomized trial ever run in the United States was the Rand health insurance experiment. And really valuable findings. And one of the things that showed was that for an upper middle class person like Harold Pollack, if you require a copayment on expensive but not particularly valuable therapeutic interventions, I'm going to use it a little less, and I'll be just as healthy, and we'll all save money, and uh, having co-payments for certain things can be a very effective strategy to have more disciplined healthcare. If I want to use a name brand versus generic drug, having more of a copay, for example. Um, One of the challenges they had in the Rand health insurance experiment is that the real results came out like a decade after the intervention, and the insurance market was just changing quite a lot in the intervening years. And so some of the findings, although they were valuable, were not applying to insurance policies that were still being sold. The other thing that's really important to think about is the representativeness of the study population. That's sometimes called randomization bias. Now, I mentioned, um, in some ways that GameStop example illustrates one aspect of that. But we have way too few older adults in pertinent trials. We have way too few people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. One of the things that, there's ethical reasons why it's really hard to properly consent people with IDD in studies, which I understand. But we have these huge problems of cardiovascular health, obesity, um, psychiatric disorders among people with IDD. And we don't have good randomized trials that really focus on this population so we can understand what's actually helpful. And that's a real problem. Um, there's also, as I mentioned, technical challenges like attrition particularly from control groups. Administrative data is one way to deal with it. Uh, there's also understanding um, the difference between an intervention that we did a trial with and what something would look like that was more typical in the real world. So a classic example is the Perry Preschool, maybe the most famous randomized trial of a social service intervention ever, where Perry Preschool in Ypsilanti, Michigan, they showed huge benefits of pre-K uh, education that lasted through people's lifetimes. Perry Preschool is way higher quality than the typical Head Start Center. I mean, Head Start is a very valuable program. I'm quite, it's certainly something that I support. The Head Start program was in existence for almost 30 years before a single Head Start Center was ever defunded because of low quality. And in a lot of ways, the quality of Head Start is way below what people received in the Perry Preschool, which was kind of the precursor to Head Start. By the way, if you're interested in the history of Head Start, the Mississippi Freedom Summer is there's a great history that connects those things. Uh, there, so it's really important that randomized trials intentionally address implementation issues, uh, and and if you can't address some of those issues, or you can't capture all the things that are important in this first bullet point here, then you be straightforward about it. And I think, by the way, NIH has a lot to offer for a lot of the private foundations that are funding research. When there's evaluation, because we really want to understand what's special about the particular thing that we did. By the way, sometimes you have the opposite effect because if you did something at real scale, you could have higher quality. The preschool versus Head Start is one where the first the first intervention is way better than the average among the things that tried to replicate it. You could imagine that the opposite could happen if the first intervention you just didn't have any trained. There's a new thing. There was no trained staff to do the thing. But then if you replicated it at scale, you could start to really have specialized training and you could do higher quality than the initial effort was able to execute. And I'll mention finally the issues of ethics and legitimacy. We owe our study subjects more than a gift card. And one of the challenges that I have doing RCTs is we sometimes think, if I just give that guy a $40 gift card, I have under my obligation to him while I watch him go out in the community and be at risk of opiate overdose or whatever. And from my mind, that is really problematic. And I know that from the point of view of my staff and colleagues, that that is a real issue. So in our own labs, let me just give you some examples. Here's, for example, a job training, surveys that were done of job training centers, managers, and staff. And 62% of the people thought there was an ethical and public relations challenge to random assignment. And the biggest issue was the denial of services to control participants. One of the challenges that you have is that people will try to sabotage your randomization if they think that the treatment is really valuable and the control condition is not. And everyone that does this has stories where people have tried to sabotage the randomization because they saw a human that they wanted to help. And there's lots of questions around the legitimacy of randomization and the impact on to study participants and an organization when you do random assignment. So one of the things that we do in our trials that I am involved in is I try very hard never to have a placebo or usual care trial, usual care arm in a trial when I'm dealing with severely vulnerable populations. So if you're working with people with opioid use disorders, everybody should get naloxone, um, information about harm reduction treatment, things like that. Uh, there's Now sometimes if you only can treat a certain number of people, you can sometimes have an ethically acceptable approach where you say I can only treat 100 people, so I'm going to do a lottery and assign to pick those 100 people. But I never want to withhold a very easily provided benefit to someone just because it will help my study. You know, if I show there's a real difference in overdose fatality between my treatment group and my control group, and it's because I've denied something to my control group that would have helped them, I'm morally accountable for that. And you know, it's not justified for me to do whatever um, to treat people however I want to treat them to maximize the scientific value of my study. I have to treat each person as a person worthy of respect and support, particularly when people are facing severe vulnerability. So I'm going to stop here. As I said, randomized trials are a critical tool to evaluate policies and interventions. They're imperfect tools that must be used well across uh, in their appropriate domains. You know where to find me. I'm happy to grab coffee and have a discussion. And thank you so much for watching my video. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to stop the recording.